By 1979, Tom Baker was the longest-serving actor to play the role of the Doctor, and arguably the most successful. Under the guidance of producer Philip Hinchcliffe, his first 3 seasons between 1974 and 1977 saw the show reach new heights of popularity, with themes of horror and violence helping them shape some of Doctor Who's most memorable stories. But the show wasn't without criticism, and ultimately a lighter tone was adopted, with Philip Hinchcliffe being replaced by Graham Williams. During his tenure, the show faced tighter budgets and a perceived drop in quality of storyline, which at times was only boosted by the performances of Tom Baker. By the time season 17 arrived, up-and-coming writer Douglas Adams was hired to become script editor, and with his appointment, it brought a level of comedy that some seem as not being fitting for a show like Doctor Who, and would ultimately become the catalyst for a major revamp of the show heading into a new decade. So, let's look at the time when Doctor Who became TOO SLAPSTICK. When Graham Williams took over as producer in 1977, the BBC gave a mandate of a shift towards a lighter, family-friendly tone, moving away from the violence and horror. Season 15 began with this transition by phasing out the gothic horror elements and introducing K9, a robotic dog that was seen something for the kids. Season 16 introduced the Time Lady Romana, and for the first ever time, a season-long story arc, The Key to Time, adding more humour, which were often channeled through Tom Baker's performances as the Doctor. Before season 17 went into production, though, Williams found himself having to make casting changes, with Mary Tam's departure leading to Lalla Ward's introduction as a new Romana, and John Leeson's replacement by David Briley as K9's voice. Script editor Anthony Reed also decided to move on after 1.5 seasons and was replaced by Douglas Adams, who had previously contributed to Doctor Who with the Key to Time story The Pirate Planet. His appointment would see him bring about a knowledge of science fiction interjected with a highbrow humour that had been prevalent in his contributions for Monty Python and his own creation The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which had made its debut on radio in 1978. For the opening story, Williams and Adams decided to go with an old tried and tested formula to get the season opening with a bang by bringing back the Daleks and their creator Davros after a near 5-year absence. For this, they reached out to veteran writer and the man who was responsible for introducing us to the Daleks, Terry Nation, who provided us with what ultimately became his final Doctor Who contribution, Destiny of the Daleks. Before getting into the story, though, there was the need to address the change in Romana's appearance. This led to Douglas Adams writing the opening scene set in a TARDIS, which included the Doctor diagnosing K9 with laryngitis, and Romana trying out new bodies for her regeneration, as if she was going clothes shopping. This scene, however, would set about the tone for the rest of the series. Whilst they were played for laughs, they also acted as a swift way of addressing urgent factors. As for the rest of the story, it was a mix of Terry Nation's traditional yet predictable formula of a Dalek story, which was now becoming somewhat dated, whilst Adams rewrote a lot of the dialogue to bring in more humour. Davros was a welcomed return, even if Michael Wisher wasn't available to reprise his role, but the Mavellans, who were supposed to be equal to the Daleks, looked like a victim of disco fashion, and now somewhat dated in appearance. Ultimately, Destiny of the Daleks failed to live up to some of its predecessors, such as Genesis of the Daleks, and there was clear conflicts in the narrative ideologies between Terry Nation and Douglas Adams. However, it does serve its purpose in grabbing the audience attention with the return of legendary antagonists. Where Destiny of the Daleks acted as a bait for the audience, the following story, City of Death, would grab that audience attention with a story that is arguably the show's best example of balancing science fiction and comedy coupled with ambition that had been lacking in the show for some time. The story was written under the pseudonym of David Agnew, a name that had been used 2 seasons back with the Invasion of Time. In reality, the story's original premise came from writer David Fisher, with Graham Williams and Douglas Adams providing the extensive rewrites. With a narrative set in France, the production team decided to test the limits of the show's budget to the extreme and take location filming outside the United Kingdom for the very first time by going to Paris. With the Doctor and Romana roaming the French capital complete with its iconic tourist sites such as the Eiffel Tower, City of Death obtained a level of glamour and style rarely obtained during the classic era. To top it off, you had an intriguing plot of Scaroff, the last of the Jaggeroff, trying to go back in time to save the destruction of his own race and thus preventing the creation of humanity. The story also has one of the show's best ensemble casts, with Julian Glover as Scaroff and his human alias Count Scorleone, Tom Shadbone as the private detective Duggan, Veteran voice actor David Graham, who was one of the first actors to voice a Dalek, playing the role of the scientist Kerensky, as well as Catherine Schell, playing the femme fatale-like Countess Scorleone. Doctor Who is at its finest when characters, narrative, acting, and production are all pulling in the right direction, and City of Death is a prime example of this, and no doubt the end product is of what Graham Williams and Douglas Adams were always aiming to achieve. So far, 2 memorable stories with polarising success. However, the show was getting a boost in the ratings due to strike action from BBC's main broadcasting rival, ITV. At the time, when there was only 3 TV channels available in the UK, and 2 of them belonging to the BBC, the strike action ITV was experiencing due to industrial disputes meant the channel was effectively off air from the 12th of August 1979, just under 3 weeks before season 17 went on air, effectively giving Doctor Who no competition for the duration of the season's first 2 stories. The result would see the viewing figures match and eventually exceed the peak popularity that was experienced during the first 3 seasons of the Tom Baker era, and episode 4, City of Death, is still to this day holding the record for the most viewed episode broadcast for Doctor Who, with 16.1 million people of the British public tuning in. ITV's strike action was eventually resolved, and the channel returned to TV screens on the 24th of October 1979, with the 3rd story of our season, Creature from the Pit, airing 3 days later, and the viewing figures returned to the standard of the Graham Williams produced era. Strike action, however, would once more play an influence later on in season 17. And where City of Death is perhaps the perfect blend of Williams and Adams' ideologies for season 17, The Creature from the Pit started to showcase some of its worst. The story itself doesn't deserve the reputation that is laid upon it, with an intriguing narrative from experienced writer David Fisher, providing a story involving a metal-producing alien ambassador captured on a jungle planet in which metal is a highly sought-after commodity. Whilst the narrative can be viewed as either bad science fiction or a spoof of bad science fiction, the guest roles are performed well, and the story carries on a tradition of Graham Williams producing strong female antagonists, in this case, Lady Adrasta. However, the design of the pit-dwelling creature Arato is unconvincing, as is the Doctor's method of communication, which got director Christopher Barry and special effects designer Matt Irvine reprimanded by the BBC hierarchy. Whilst Creature from the Pit was the 3rd story to be broadcast, it was the first story to be filmed, and as such, it was Lalla Ward's debut as Romana, and whilst it is clear that she is still trying to establish her approach to the character, by now the dynamic between the Doctor and Romana too had been established from the previous 2 stories. Whilst her role is in ways a continuation of the characteristics set by Mary Tamm's approach to the character, there is more of a warmth between Lalla Ward's incarnation of the character and the Doctor. This was in no doubt helped by the beginnings of a romance between Lalla Ward and Tom Baker. Additionally, the character of Romana often became the straight and serious character in contrast to the 4th Doctor's eccentric and anti-establishment persona, with her also having the ability to get herself out of a sticky situation, with an intellect similar to the Doctor's. This unique Doctor-companion relationship would carry on through season 17 and eventually into season 18. Hi, well done for making it this far into the video. If you haven't done already, don't forget to click to subscribe if you want more updates on the Watcher on Who. Thank you. Nightmare of Eden, like The Creature from the Pit, is a story of interesting science fiction ideas overshadowed by production and character design. Written by Bob Baker, who spent the 1970s producing several stories with his writing partner Dave Martin, The Nightmare of Eden focuses on science fiction ideas such as hyperspace, more adult-style narratives such as drug trafficking. However, the design of the Mandrels, who are envisioned as being something for the audience to be scared of, are pretty timid in their realisation due to their design, and the Doctor's Pied Piper of Hamelin-styled approach in rounding up the Mandrels with the use of his whistle is a simplistic and childlike comedy idea that threatens to dilute a somewhat adult-themed narrative. From The Creature from the Pit onwards, the humour elements of season 17 become at times overwhelming, as if they were put into place to disguise any limits in the narrative and distract from the style of the story, and such is the case with the Horns of Nimon. An interesting concept of a story with Greek mythology acting as a basis, involving the parasite-like Nimon who lays planets to waste. The narrative progresses at a slow pace and the feel of a story that suffers most from the season's limited budget. As a result, the humour is played up as a distraction once again, with the over-the-top acting from Graham Crowden's portrayal of the character Soldeed, and a particular over-the-top slapstick scene involving the Doctor attempting to repair the TARDIS, and it making cartoonish noises as his efforts fail. Whilst comedy and humour have a place in Doctor Who, it is when it's playing an importance in the narrative progression, and it has to be the right comedy to complement the style of the story, which in the case of the Horns of Nimon, it doesn't, and like previous story, The Nightmare of Eden, it dampens the mood. Season 17 benefited earlier on from strike action from ITV that boosted the ratings. However, the production team would experience strike action of their own that affected the studio shooting of the season's finale, Shada, leaving it ultimately unfinished and never broadcast. Written by Douglas Adams himself, the story was initially perceived as the jewel in the crown in season 17, and subsequent attempts on VHS, audio and DVD to complete the story show a level of humour akin to City of Death, as Adams sets part of the story in around the world of Cambridge University, where he studied. The fact that Adams had a direct involvement in the writing of both City and Death and Shada perhaps reflects why his trademark style of humour are more fitting within the narrative as opposed to the other four stories, where the humour lacks quality and is used to paper over the cracks of the narrative either from the writer or Douglas Adams providing rewrites. To say that Shada was destined to be the highlight of season 17 is somewhat premature. It's an interesting and engaging story, but nowhere near the quality of City of Death, and doesn't quite hold enough narrative to complement 6 episodes that it was allotted. That said though, had it been broadcast, it would have given season 17 an adequate finale. With Shada never being completed, season 17 ended abruptly with the Horns of Nimon as the televised finale, which results in a downbeat feel, which was understandable as the story was never designed to bring the season to a close. The Graham Williams produced era of Doctor Who had been plagued by budget reductions and production issues, as he worked on changing the direction of the show following its more successful era. In hindsight, a seemingly impossible task, and season 17 was certainly not without its issues. In the end, the stress and demand of the show resulted in Graham Williams deciding that 3 seasons was enough, and subsequently stepped down from his role as producer. Following on from him was Douglas Adams, who had found further success with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which had been commissioned for a novelisation and ultimately into a TV series. Going forward, John Nathan Turner would be promoted from his role as production unit manager to replace Graham Williams as producer, and would set about revamping all aspects of the show during season 18 as he brought Doctor Who into the 1980s. Whilst doing the research for the making of this video, I naturally went back and watched all of season 17, given that it had been a while since I saw some of the stories. With the preconception of the season being played for laughs and all slapstick comedy, I found that the more I watched, the more removed I felt from my initial opinion. I would even go as far as saying that there are other seasons that lean on the comedy and slapstick theories more heavily, in particular Sylvester McCoy's debut season, season 24. The humour elements are actually more well balanced with the drama than I remembered. You only need to look at the serious concern of the Doctor's face when he discovers he's on Skaro in Destiny of the Daleks, or perhaps him explaining Count Scarleone's true identity to the Countess in City of Death, or maybe him shunning the scientist Tryst at the conclusion of Nightmare of Eden, to understand that when you remove the humour from these stories, there are some serious narratives of interesting science fiction ideologies and some fairly adult themes. In this case though, the humour helps disguise some of the elements in maintaining Doctor Who as having family entertainment values, which is what Graham Williams was tasked to do when he became producer in 1977. Douglas Adams, as a writer, is great at mixing humour and science fiction into a narrative, and you only need to look at The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to see his ability at its finest. The reasoning behind his appointment was to inject humour as a script editor, and I feel one of the main purposes of this, other than to keep the show family friendly, was to add as a distraction to the production team's struggle to make the budget meet the demands of the writer's vision. And this is where I actually feel season 17 fails. The humour alone isn't enough to form that distraction, and in addition, I feel The Creature from the Pit, Nightmare of Eden, and The Horns of Nimon all suffer from a pedestrian, plodding narrative, in particular in the middle section of the story, and are filled with meaningless and boring padding. When the formula worked, primarily in City of Death, it was brilliant, but City of Death is the one story of season 17 that doesn't seem to struggle in delivering its visual ambition, and the Paris location shooting certainly attributed to that. But ask yourself this: is City of Death regarded as a great story purely based on what it delivers? Or is it maybe because it stands head and shoulders above all other stories of that season? Would it have been as greatly appreciated had it been shot in London, for example, or the set designs had a more cheaper looking appearance? Also, If City of Death had been done in one of the earlier seasons, how would it have fared? That I'll let you decide. But nevertheless, City of Death, in my opinion, is the strongest of the season because everything worked with it. Alas, with the other 4 stories that were broadcast, they all have flaws that undermine their potential. At times, the humour simply didn't work or was too silly, and this is where I feel Season 17 gets its reputation of being too slapstick. Those comedic moments that don't quite pay off are remembered for the wrong reasons and fail to do their job, and before you know it, the issues Doctor Who was experiencing at the time became fully exposed. Throughout the season, though, there is one shining beacon of quality that stands out, and that is Tom Baker. His passion and eccentricity that he put into his performances as a Doctor often elevated a lot of his stories, and perhaps the example is none more greater than in Season 17. Over his long tenure in Doctor Who, Tom Baker gradually started exerting more and more influence on how the shows were recorded, and while it isn't unusual for the leading star to act in this way, there is the argument by the time we watch Season 17, Tom Baker's influence and in some cases ego created clashes with other actors and the production team. On the one hand, you could view this as star power going to his head, but on the other hand, maybe it was his determination to get the best out of what was being worked with, and throughout Season 17, he certainly makes the most of his dialogue and scenes, knowing that it was often on his shoulders to carry the show. Season 17 also perhaps falls in its ambitions, due to it also falling at a point when the show was in need of a revamp. The successful formula of the show throughout the Fourth Doctor era was now growing tired, as Doctor Who was set to venture into the 1980s, and as ambitious as the stories still were, it was in dire need of refresh ideas, which ultimately John Nathan Turner brought about when he took over for Season 18. But what do you think of Season 17? Did the comedy go too far? Did the show's production values undermine it? Was Tom Baker's ego out of control? Was it simply bad writing, or perhaps it's a misunderstood season that demands re-watching? As ever, let me know in the comments of what you think of this season. And if you want to know more about what happened in the following season that saw John Nathan Turner adopt his new broom philosophy and ultimately saw the end of the Fourth Doctor, then I suggest you take a look at this video here. But for now, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.